was just going to say, you know, with Spandau, everybody has to learn their craft. I mean, Mozart's Juvenilia, so to speak, or Jane Austen's Juvenilia, it's not brilliant. It was your first novel, and didn't you think in part, you know, you needed to work out how to do it?
Well, yeah, people ask me, you know, what was the last thing you wrote before Spandau Phoenix? Short stories or this, and I say the last thing I wrote was my college term paper 12 years before or 10 years before. Yeah, you got to learn it at some point. But that gets back to the other thing we've talked about before, which is how much is learned and how much is just there.
Well, I think a lot of it is innate, but you know, there's Larry King, who I think is a very insightful writer, once pointed out to me after I had confessed accidentally, because I didn't actually intend to say it to her, that I had been bored by her first novel. And one of my horrible book-selling glitches was that I returned all the copies of this really collectible book because I didn't like it. And instead of like bopping me over the head, she very kindly said to me that I was surely bored because almost all first novels are about setup, particularly in a series, you know, and in a mystery, because by the time you've got the structure of the plot and the setup of what the cast is going to be, there's only like for a story.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, that was such a great thing for her to point out to me, because I oftentimes really bond to readers' authors' second books. Oftentimes first books just don't, if the voice is good, if the language is good, I kind of skim through the rest of it on the theory that it probably isn't going to really get me.
I see.
The second book is the killer book for me.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not surprised that you feel that Black Cross was the second book for you as an author once you kind of got through this exercise.
Yeah.
Got some confidence. I mean, I wouldn't call you shy or shrinking, but it's kind of gutsy to expose yourself on a page like that.
Yeah, it is. And for me, the trick for me, the difficulty about Black Cross was I'm not Jewish, and I was writing a book about Jewish characters set during the Holocaust. That's pretty gutsy move, and you open yourself to a lot of criticism.
Well, that's that PC stuff that I just hate. I mean, you're not a woman either. And
well,
you're
exactly.
not a lot of things, you know, but hey, it's fiction.
Exactly. But that's why a great moment for me was a friend came back, one of my dad's friends came back from a vacation and said, this was in the heyday of Grisham, when Grisham sold like 90% of all the books sold. And he said, there's a bookstore where Greg's book is sold and John Grisham's books are not sold. And I said, where is that? Or my dad said, and the guy said, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And I thought, okay, maybe I accomplished what I set out to do with that book, you know, to have sort of independent verification. Yes, this is real experience, or it seems to be real experience.
Do you think you also gravitated towards, you know, that the history and the model because you hadn't had an experience in putting a book together? It kind of gave you at least a structure? I
think so, yeah. There's built-in framework in a historical mystery that, yeah, it lets you concentrate on the other things without having to build that scaffolding or the spine, you know?
Yeah, and there's kind of a beginning and an end to the narrative and all that good stuff. Was Spandau Phoenix about Rudolph Hess?
Yeah, it was. And that just came out of a 60 Minutes episode. But I think my fascination with Germany came from the fact that I was born there. My dad served in the American Army. And so I'd always grown up very aware of that history. And they'd always told me, if you're born in Germany, if you happen to be there when you're 18, you can be drafted in the German Army. You know, I always had this feeling about it. And I saw a 60 Minutes episode about Hess, and here was this 90-year-old man held in a prison alone by all four allies at a cost of millions of dollars a year, and it just seemed to make no sense whatever unless there was something that was being concealed. And so that started me on this long, long trail, and it gave me a book so complex. When cult fans ask me questions now, I can't even answer them. It's so complicated, I don't know the answers myself now.
And also, 11 books later, you've taken in and regurgitated an awful lot of stuff. How can you possibly remember it all?
That's true. That's embarrassing to say, because it's almost like you're betraying your own book. But I guess it's like an actor making a movie. Whenever you see an actor on TV and they're asking them about the movie that's being released, that's a year ago in their life, and they're like, you know, they can't really speak to what went on in them while they made that movie because they're doing something else. Books are the same.
Do you know one reason that I do author interviews at our events at the Poison Pen?
Why?
Because so many authors can't remember the book. That's my job.
Yeah.
My job is to sit there with the cast in mind and the plot and prompt you.
Well, you're one of the few who actually reads the books these days. You know what I mean? The people in the business who read the books, whether in media or even in the book selling trade. You know that. I mean, that's all I'm saying.
Well, it's very hard, actually. When I finish a newsletter and go into the store, I've already downloaded it, and I'll have customers come in and say, "What's wonderful this month?" And I'm already in January. And it's like, I have no idea what we're selling this month.
Right.
So I can easily translate that to how you would feel, you know, when you finish something and move on to the next. The other question that I always find intriguing is, you know, they always wanted to know what's your favorite book. And of course, the answer 98% of the time is the book you're working on.
Yeah.
It's the book that's in your mind. It's the book you can remember.
Yeah, the next book. That's right, not this book.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, not the published book.
Right.
The book you're in the process of writing.
That's right. And so many authors, I hate this, they say, what's your best book? And they will say it's the one they're schlepping around the country. Oh, this is the best. I would never do that. I'm usually painfully honest and will admit sometimes that some of my earliest books are the best, you know?
Well, and I'm not sure that anybody who's creative can judge their work as well.
Yeah.
You're very close to it. I think Robert Everett is an author that I greatly admire, and I've said this before on this show. He said a really insightful thing. He said there are always three versions of a book. There's the one in your head, the one you want to write. Then there's the book you actually wrote, which isn't necessarily a perfect translation. In fact, almost surely isn't a perfect translation of the one in your head. But then the real book is the book that every single reader reads. That's the real book for that reader.
Exactly, and there are millions of those books for each reader, no
and in
doubt.
every language that you happen to be in. You're translated fairly widely.
I thought I was translated to like a dozen languages. It's like 25 or 30. It staggers me because I try to think, okay, how are those people relating to something happening in Little Natchez, Mississippi, in the South with kinds of people they've never met? But it does apparently. Now, not always perfectly. I found. In London, England, my readership has gone down for some reason in the last couple of years, while in America my sales are booming. Something I'm doing, I think, as I focus more and more on my little postage stamp of soil, as Faulkner said, it's not translating as well in Britain. Now, for some reason, I'm huge in New Zealand and Australia. Why? Is it because that was sort of a rural type area as well? I don't know the answer to those things.
You know, it could easily be the vendor. British publishing has been sort of hijacked by Tesco. They've gone into, Lee Child and I had a very interesting discussion about it because he is very big in Britain, his native country, as well as in this country. And he said that, you know, it's a mistake to confuse market share with profitability. And if a publisher is going for market share, they're willing to surrender a lot of stuff to a mass outlet like Tesco, which is sort of the Walmart of the UK. Whereas if you're going for profitability, you wouldn't sell stuff that cheaply to somebody just so they could sell tons of it. And so the taste, you know, it may be that it's the retail system is responsible.
I see.
You know, it may not be you and the public necessarily, but it's the sort of gatekeepers who, you know, let's face it, they have tastes like everybody else. I've always thought it was so dangerous that the major chains and all have basically a single mystery buyer, for example. You know, one person can't love it all. I can't love it all, so I try to get my staff involved, you know, in stuff that we do. Everybody on our staff can order and sell whatever they like. It isn't just about what I like, because that would be so restrictive.
Well, I'm, you know, in the position I'm in now, I meet the buyers from the big chains and big outlets and the distributors, and you realize, you're right, it's just one person's taste making decisions that affect whether the public ever sees an author, even.
That's right.
in this huge chain or in this grocery store or Costco or whatever it is. And if you're not there, some people will just never see you, period.
I think that's true, and you know, you're a thoughtful kind of guy, so you'll maybe agree with me that this is the Platonic question: who will govern the governors? The danger of any one person having a concentration of power, taste, whatever it is that inevitably there is some kind of corruption, whether it's just personal taste or the guy that took you out to lunch, or you like a sales rep better than another, or your mother really likes the author. I mean,
the real danger to me is this. I think it works that way because the real power that underlies that type of decision making is next quarter's stock price. These outlets are not companies that predominantly sell books. They sell everything. They sell big boxes of Raisin Bran, and they sell books, and they sell everything. And so to them, it doesn't make that much difference if it's Greg Iles or Lee Child in the rack. It's, as long as it sells at a certain level, it doesn't matter to them. And so if their buyer is biased or chooses what we might consider wrongly or whatever, it really makes no difference to the company.
So what it really comes down to is, to be a successful author today, you almost have to become a brand. You have to. There's a moment in which, in most books, and I need to look here really quickly, but yes, when a first novel comes out, most of the time the title is big and the author's name is somewhere relatively small. And there's always a moment when this is going to work, when the